I'm Luukas Ilves, Deputy Director and Senior Fellow at the Lisbon Council, a digital economy think tank here in Brussels. In the last couple of years, we've gone from cybersecurity being a fairly unregulated matter to having a really big and fairly full legal landscape here in Europe. We have the NIS directive, which on the one hand affects cloud service providers, but also for all sorts of critical service providers in sectors from transport to medicine. We have the General Data Protection Regulation, which really tells you that anyone in the world who's processing personal data, which is really everyone in the world, needs to think about the security and the integrity of that data. We also have the eIDAS regulation, which is about the use of eID, strong identities, and certain trust service providers, like, for instance, SSL providers. Then we have something, we have some sector-specific bits of legislation. For instance, for the financial sector, we have the new Payment Services Directive, which has very specific standards on security that financial services have to provide. And on top of all of that, we have more coming. We have something called the Cybersecurity Act, which is going to upgrade the EU Cybersecurity Agency and come up with a new certification framework for cybersecurity products and services. So what that basically means is that if you're any company in Europe providing either goods or services, you probably have some kind of European legal environment that affects your cybersecurity. And some of that's going to come directly from the European legislation, some of that's going to come from national implementations. Now that's just the legal side. That's just the beginning, right? This framework is now out there, but the real question is, how is that actually going to be turned into a reality in terms of how companies follow the regulation, in terms of the technical standards and the best practices that actually are used to follow all of that, in terms of how national regulatory authorities actually go and see whether that regulation has been implemented, and how that in turn affects the state of cybersecurity. For me, the biggest question is really about the data. One of the ways in which the US has been very different to Europe is that just about every US state and many sectors on a federal level have had reporting requirements for breaches and other types of incidents for many years now. In Europe's case, you've had a few sectors that have had breach notification requirements, and some countries have had that for personal data, but now with the GDPR and the NIS directive, we have more or less across the board breach notification requirements and incident notification requirements for most larger at least European companies. And that's going to mean that in a year or two we actually can come up with a much more comprehensive assessment of the state of cybersecurity in Europe. And we'll know whether we're ahead or behind of the US and other parts of the world. We'll know which sectors are doing well and which sectors are doing poorly. If you really take all of these regulations, and there's a lot out there, and you boil it down to what they say, they all basically say one thing: deal with security. Now, for companies that are really affected by cybersecurity, it's not going to be just enough to be out there and dealing with it. Frankly, what policymakers need is they need you to get engaged with them, because a lot of how that very general message of deal with it actually plays out in practice is going to depend on the interplay between the market and the regulators. It's also, when we talk about certification, which we'll soon have on our table, it's going to depend on what type of certification frameworks actually get adopted. What the certification frameworks actually require in terms of how much time and money a company that wants to put a product or service out there has to invest, how clear the information is for companies consuming those products. What are the types of things that get standardized, and where do we say that, look, maybe it's a little too early to standardize it because artificial intelligence or blockchain mean that the state of the art is changing so quickly, and maybe the state of the bad guys is changing so quickly too. So there's a lot of question marks. And I'm a former policymaker. I can say that sitting in a government office, you have part of the picture, and in cybersecurity you actually have a pretty good bit of the picture because you're getting information from your national CERT. You've got some amount of information about what the regulator is seeing when he talks to companies. but you don't get the whole picture. So especially to the bigger companies out there that have the resources beyond just basic regulatory compliance, I would say, please go and engage with the policymakers, go and engage with the vendors, and have this broad discussion around what's going on, what needs to be done, which best practices, which mandates work, which ones don't, what's cost effective. Because one of the important topics we do have to talk about in the context of all this legislation is cost. And cost is not a very popular topic for policymakers, because policymakers want to say, look, you should deal with security, it's important. But the reality is security isn't free. It means investing in people, it means investing in new equipment, paying for services, it means organizational learning and consulting services that are not free either. And sometimes it can be an opportunity cost, because making something secure might make it better, but it might also make it more expensive, limit some of the features or functionality, or just require more time to develop. So that means that companies internally need to think about which are the processes they really want to invest in when it comes to security. And as a society more broadly, we need to know where we want to focus our security efforts. And that's not to set up a false dichotomy between security and efficiency and effectiveness, but we also want to think about ways in which we can do security in a way that is cost effective. My main advice to policymakers comes in two bits. For European policymakers as a whole, we need to make the framework work now. And it's not enough just to pass the legislation. We need to make sure that the implementing acts for the NIS directive, the potential industry standards that we agree to under GDPR, the implementing acts under EIDAS, that all of that coheres. Ideally, a company that might be covered by several of these bits of European legislation that has national requirements should be able to have one incident reporting format that lets them cover their reporting requirements for different incidents. They should be able to use one or relatively few standards frameworks. We think as policymakers in terms of legal acts, but a CISO does not think about how do I comply with A, B, and C regulation ideally. He's thinking about how do I comply across my enterprise with a security standards framework or use the right types of products. So I think we need to get the interface right between the legal framework that we now mostly have and will have fairly soon and what that looks like for companies. And that means that we have to have this continuous feedback loop over the next couple of years. Now the other bit, and this is in particular to lawmakers and policymakers sitting in national capitals, is that we need to get over some of our disagreements between European countries. Let's be frank about things. We don't, in fact, in practice, trust each other completely, at least not in our acts, even if we do in our words. We look at operational cooperation and cybersecurity, the willingness to use common standardization frameworks, and there's a readiness to talk about it, but there's still some hesitation. And it's going to be a hard collective effort to get over that. Now, there are practical reasons for why that trust isn't perfect. Look, it's mathematically difficult to get 27, 28 sovereign country security authorities to have complete trust in each other. It's just a lot of people in the room. But that doesn't mean that we don't make an effort, because we have to bear in mind what the alternative is. The alternative is a fragmented European landscape. It's one in which everyone's worse off. We have less data, we don't understand the attack surface as well, and we're not able to respond coherently to threats. At the end of the day, there isn't a contradiction between national sovereignty, European sovereignty, and at the same time openness. And I think we need to find forms of cooperation on standards, on how we relate to companies informally, on operational cooperation that let us maximize all three of those. Again, national sovereignty, European sovereignty, and a broad, globally open approach to markets. That's a tall order. I know there are a lot of caveats and a lot of difficulties there, but we have to aim high.